Thank you for this opportunity to come and talk about our legacy, a living legacy that is so much a part of our synod, because we are truly the descendant of the ministerium. And so the Southeastern Pennsylvania Synod is the living legacy of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. And so this tercentenary is sort of an empowerment to revisit to celebrate the heritage and then to embrace the ministry and then welcome the future. And so here we are in the second part of the Muhlenberg, thinking about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and enjoying what he gave to us. And as he arrived in the Delaware Valley on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, he headed up in 1752. He headed up to Hackensack in New York City. And he was there to preach in Dutch and English and in German, and he was to help the congregation reorganize and get its bearings so that it could minister in the future to the children and the descendants. And as he was leaving Hackensack in a wagon, he said there was a downpour, and then they got in a boat, and then he said something horrible happened. He said, we got hit by millions and millions of mosquitoes. And he's writing this to the Reverend Fathers in London and in Halle, and he says, throughout the journey we had heavy rain and were surrounded by millions of mosquitoes, a kind of large, poisonous, stinging gnat, which made life miserable for us. So there's Henry crossing into New York City, and then in 1762 he's out in Trapp in his house there, and the provost, the superintendent of the Swedish Lutheran churches in the Delaware Valley, arrived to stay overnight, Karl Krueger. And Muhlenberg and Krueger had a great relationship. They were great pals and workers together in the mission here in the Delaware Valley. And he said Krueger couldn't sleep because, once again, we were surrounded by, he was bothered all night by the buzzing of these mosquitoes overhead. Henry and the insects. And it never changed. And then in 1774, as he had sailed down to Savannah, he said it was just horrible. Not only was there this overpowering stench in the ship, but overhead in the hammocks we were laying, there were these mosquitoes just continually biting us, these gnats with their poisonous stings. And he said we couldn't sleep. It was absolutely horrible. And then there were these huge cockroaches. Actually, he's talking about palmetto bugs. And he says they gnaw at you. They eat your food. They eat your clothing, and they bite and they sting you. And then Henry had an idea. You know what I'd like to do with all of these mosquitoes and these cockroaches? I'd like to send them to Europe so that they could be in the little curio cabinets, like the ones we have in Halle. We can put them all there so everybody over there can enjoy them. So here we have Henry's idea of what to do with the insects that bothered him and plagued him throughout his time here in the Delaware Valley. And then that perceptive Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, as he was in New York City, had an observation about the city that never sleeps. He says, the people here are astonished when they see German dress. For some of the natives think that New York is the metropolis of the world, and that all other regions are only suburbs of New York. July 1752. There's Henry's insight into the city of New York. So we have come today to celebrate ministry, to celebrate our heritage, to embrace ministry, and then to welcome the future. On October 3rd, 1764, Henry left the parsonage in Philadelphia. He picked up a book. This is his copy of the Book of Common Prayer, and you knew that it was his copy of the Book of Common Prayer. And he headed off to St. Paul Episcopal Church at 3rd and Walnut Street. And he was there for morning prayer. As he said, the pastors read morning prayer, and then he heard the preacher George Whitefield preach. And Henry was astonished and liked it. Now, George Whitefield was a part of the Great Awakening, an indigenous religious movement here on this side of the Atlantic in the colonies. And it was throughout the British seaboard. It started out with people like Conrad Beisel and Theodor Frelinghuysen preaching in Dutch, and then you had Solomon Stoddard up in New York preaching about conversion and revivals. And then you had it coming into Pennsylvania. You had Zinzendorf joining in, and the Tennants, the Gilbert Tennants, being a part of that. And Tennant's pamphlet, The Dangers of an Unconverted Ministry. And this was causing dissension in the churches. This was ripping the Presbyterian church apart between the traditionalists and those who would embrace this new vision, this awakening, this revival, these conversions. And George Whitefield was a part of that experience. He had come here in the late 1739, and he was here for 2 years, and he preached in all 13 colonies, and he was preaching to crowds of 20,000 people. Here are the number of trips that he made throughout the Delaware Valley. He was in the churches of Philadelphia. He headed back to England, and he came back in the 1760s. And this is where he is in the city of Philadelphia. And so on October 3rd, Henry picks up his Book of Common Prayer, goes to St. Paul Episcopal Church to hear George Whitefield. October 17th, he picks up his Book of Common Prayer, and he heads over to the academy that will eventually become the University of Pennsylvania at 4th and Arch, and Dr. Smith will read the prayers, the common prayers. Dr. Smith had preached in Trapp back in the 1740s in the afternoon, an English service. This was the vision of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. And then after the prayer, after Matins, George Whitefield preached. That was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. And then he invited George Whitefield to come and to preach in Zion Lutheran Church in 1770. The morning service was held in German, and in that afternoon service, George Whitefield went into the pulpit and preached in English for an hour. And Henry loved it and had nothing but praise to say about the sermon and how the people accepted it. He disagreed with George Whitefield. He disagreed with him about baptism. He disagreed with him about predestination. But that did not prevent Henry from embracing him and hearing the good and inviting an Episcopalian, somebody from another confession, into Zion Lutheran Church to be in that pulpit to preach the word in English. Remember what he said in the document that went into the cornerstone of Zion Lutheran Church in 1766 when it was dedicated. Think kindly and sympathetically about other religious persuasions. That was Henry. He was keeping his fingers on the pulse of American religious life. He wanted to feel it. He wanted to be a part of it. This was part of the surroundings, and he wanted to hear it all and take it all in. There was no insulation. There was no isolation here with Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. But that did not change him. He heard it, he appreciated, he loved it. He offered the opportunity for his people to experience that preaching of George Whitefield. But he stayed in the historic liturgy. He will stay with the historic liturgy that he brought over from the Church of London, and he continues that format within the church. But he offers up opportunities for others to come and offer other opportunities for worship within the walls of the Lutheran sanctuaries. It's open. There's no insulation. There is no isolation. And so on October 2nd, 1763, he notes in his journal, he says, George Whitefield was in the New Presbyterian Church preaching on Matthew 25. He preached for an hour. We in our church celebrated St. Michael and all angels, along with the propers, for that Sunday. He knew his identity. He knew his core. He knew what he wanted to do. But he opened up the doors of the church for possibilities because he was not an isolationist. He was not insulated. Celebrating our heritage, embracing ministry, welcoming the future. This is what Henry Melchior Muhlenberg was all about. And in the Lutheran Synod that was held in St. Michael's in October 1763, on Tuesday afternoon, the procession of clergy from the schoolhouse into this sanctuary Who led them? There were 2 Episcopalian priests there to lead and to participate in the Lutheran Synod, Jacob Ducci and Charles Inglis. After them came Gilbert Ten and Samuel Finley, the Presbyterians. They were walking into St. Michael's Lutheran Church, and they were going to be a part of that synod. They did not have voice, they did not have vote, but they were a part of that experience. And they were followed by George Whitefield, who went into the pulpit at St. Michael's in 1763, who preached the sermon for the synod. No insulation, no isolation here. He was open to it all, and he wanted to bring it all within the walls of the sanctuary. Talk about ecumenical partnerships and interfaith events. Henry Muhlenberg was already out there. That is nothing new for us. He was connected, he maintained those relationships, he knew each and every one of these individuals, he visited with them, and he invited them into the church, and they participated in that life. Ecumenical partnerships, that's part of embracing the ministry by Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. Now I'm going to talk about an individual named Johann Handschuh. He was one of the assistants that came over from Halle. Handschuh had been born in Halle, raised in that town, and this is where he went, to the Halle Foundations for his schooling. He experienced the orphanage for 2,000 orphans. He was a part of that. He was a part of the printing press, the pharmacy, the school. This was all part of his upbringing. And he came to the Delaware Valley to be an assistant. He started out in Lancaster, made a mess of it, and Henry had to go in and clean it up. Henry put him in Germantown, and the congregation just exploded right in front of Henry, all because of Handschuh. And then in 1752, and I shared this at the bishop's convocation, 1751, the pastors were out in Strauchsburg, which is just north of Reading, and there were these wonderful mountains, and they needed a breath of fresh air. So Henry says, let's go take a walk, and they go hiking, and they go up to the highest peak. They go to the highest peak of that mountain, and they're sitting there in this bright, clear, fresh air, just talking and having a great time together, getting away from it all, getting up to 30,000 feet, retreat, refreshment, and they see 3 eagles flying overhead. And in that moment, they remembered the building at the Halle Foundations in Halle, Germany. That little building, those 2 eagles on the top of that building. And they remember the good old days in Halle. They remember their mission in Pennsylvania, and they give thanks for what they are doing. But that moment took them away. It was a transfiguration moment. They were transfigured on the top of that mountain. And then it says in the journals, along came Johann Handschuh with his chorus of lament. And we knew we were in Pennsylvania. Johann Handschuh tried the patience of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. He asked that he be recalled, but Halle turned a deaf ear to that. He ruined the congregation in Lancaster. He ruined the congregation in Germantown. He's working part-time at Franklin's Press in Philadelphia, proofing German texts. And the assistant pastor, Heinzelmann, dies in 1756, and he comes unofficially as the assistant pastor. And then in 1757, unexpectedly, Peter Brunholz dies of alcoholism. And Handschuh has the opportunity to now become the senior pastor of St. Michael's. And Henry comes into town to negotiate the call, to set up the papers for Johann Handschuh. And he hopes and he prays that Johann Handschuh has learned from his previous mistakes and is ready to make a new start. Henry will give him a chance. And he's sitting there in the council meeting, November 21st, 1757, hoping, praying, talking with Handschuh. And he says to Handschuh, now let's put your salary into the call papers. And Hanschu turns and looks at Henry Melchior Muhlenberg and says, "I'm not a belly pastor." Translation, "I'm not in this for the money." And Henry lost it. After all he had done for Johann Hanschu, Henry lost it at that moment. And this is what we talked about at the bishop's convocation. Henry stood up and took a pair of scissors. He cut his name out of the call. He cut out Brunholz's name and Heinzelmann's name, and he threw them in the fire. He got on his horse. He went out to trap, and he did not come back to the city of Philadelphia for 3 years. I think he was upset. He does return in 1760 to begin the negotiations and to come back. Johann Hanschu was not Henry's favorite colleague. He would not have been welcomed at the synod office. Johann Hanschu died on October 9th, 1764. And all that has transpired is now forgotten. And Henry sits down, because Henry is now the senior pastor at St. Michael's, and he jots down a note. He sends a note, and he sends it to the rector of Christ Episcopal Church. And he has 2 requests. My first request is, you're the church with the tall tower and the biggest bells. Would you kindly toll your bells at 2 p.m. on October 11th, when the funeral procession for our colleague Hanschu begins from the schoolhouse and goes to St. Michael's Church. The second request is, can we borrow your pall? And to this, Jacob Ducci says absolutely yes. No problem. We will ring the bells of our church, our Episcopal Church, for our Lutheran colleague on October 11th, 1764. And so when that procession starts out from the schoolhouse to head to St. Michael's Lutheran Church to bury that pastor, the procession is led by 2 doctors of divinity, 2 professors from the academy, 3 Episcopal priests, 2 Presbyterian ministers, 1 Baptist preacher, 1 Swedish missionary, 2 German Reformed pastors, George Whitfield, and the 3 Lutheran pastors. Ecumenical partnerships, interfaith events, that was Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, 1764. In the council minutes of October 9th, the eight deacons were to be the pallbearers. Between October 9th and October 11th, that changed. The pallbearers were all the clergy from the Episcopal, Presbyterian, Episcopal Baptist Church, the Swedish ministry, and the Reformed Church. They were the pallbearers who escorted the coffin covered with the pall from Christ Episcopal Church into St. Michael's Lutheran Church. And there, in front of the pulpit, they would lay to rest Johann Hanschu next to Johann Heinzelmann, Peter Brunholz, and there he would be laid to rest. And all that had transpired prior to that was forgotten. It was over. It was finished. But what is important to see here is this ecumenical partnership that Henry has going on in the Delaware Valley. It's nothing new for us. This is our heritage. This is our ministry. And this is the witness of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. As we celebrate that heritage, as we embrace that ministry, and as we welcome the future. If you'd turn into the pew rack and pull out that blue hymnal and turn to hymn number 114, let's pause for a second. In thee is gladness. Hymn number 114, just one verse to give a breath between, as we move into the final portion of the presentations about Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. In thee is gladness amid all sadness, Jesus, sunshine of my heart. By thee are given the gifts of heaven, thou the true Redeemer art. Our hearts are pining, our times thinking, thus they surely hath built securely. Muhlenberg and candidacy. This is a lighter moment again. What Henry did is he took the 2 urban parishes and he made that one territory, and then he had the 2 rural parishes of Trapp and New Hanover, where he stayed until 1761, when he returned to the city until the outbreak of the war. And he worked with a number of assistants who were sent from Halle, and he would place them where he thought they would be, where they would really, could use their gifts and graces for ministry. And so he left Brunholz in the beginning down at St. Michael's, and he took care of the rural parishes and then did those circuits. And then in 1764, 2 assistants arrived, one by the name of Voigt and the other by the name of Krug. And they were introduced to the congregation of St. Michael. They were introduced to the congregations out in Trapp and New Hanover. And people were wondering where they would be placed. And so there it was. Henry had to make this difficult decision as to what he wanted to do. And out came the cheer from Philadelphia. Voigt, Voigt, Voigt has a loud, pleasing voice. He's the one that belongs in Philadelphia. My, how things have changed, right? And there it is. Now, Krug. Krug. Weak, unpleasant voice, and a monotone like Hanshu. Nor can he see very well. He has to put his face close to the book when he reads. He's not suitable for church or school. So Henry's stuck with the decision as to what do we do? He has a large congregation. He's probably pastoring at this point between 1,500, 2,000 people. He's the senior pastor. He has an assistant. He's looking for a second assistant. Who do I take? Voigt, Voigt, Voigt with the loud, clear voice? Or do I take Krug? Who is the winner? The winner is, for the election, is Andreas Krug. Voigt got sent out to the 2 rural parishes. Why? Came down to chemistry. And Henry sized it up within a week. We're going to put Voigt out into the rural parishes. Why? If I put him with Hanshu, I've got 2 hypochondriacs together. And it's going to drive me crazy. The chemistry ain't going to work. And what's a hypochondriac? Well, they're do no good, because a hypochondriac, they look at trifles through magnifying glasses, looking at the little things. And that's not Henry. And so he makes that decision to send Voigt out, and you stay out in the rural congregation, and Krug stayed in town. Engaged in social ministry, the last part of my presentation on the ministry, the heritage of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. He understood social ministry from early on. When he was a student at Göttingen, his professor encouraged him and his classmates to open a charity school in Göttingen. This is the only surviving photograph of that school where he taught poor boys reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. He understood social ministry and the need for it. When he went to Halle, what did he do? He was to administer the orphanage and to teach and to be a part of that mission. When he went to Groß-Hennersdorf, in addition to preaching once in a while as the assistant pastor, he was working in the orphanage, teaching and administration. Social ministry was in the heart of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. He brought that vision of social ministry with him to this side of the Atlantic. And in the Croft Memorial Library, as I discovered in this year, as I've been working with Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, this is a book that was published by Johann Jakob Schmidt, and Henry had requested a copy of this book, Biblical Physics. And so when he received it in 1743, he signed the page next to it, "This book belongeth to Henry Muhlenberg and his heirs," 1753. And it went down to his son, Henry Jr. And he signed this in English because he wanted the assessors to see this when he died and they settled his estate, that this book belonged to him and his heirs. And he writes it in English because that's the language of the courts, and he wants it made clear. But on the other page, the back of the title page, is this, in his glorious handwriting in English. What is it? It's a recipe. It's for a medicine. Turlington had patented a medicine that became known as the balsam of life in 1744. And he distributed it in these bottles. That was what the patent allowed him to do. But this recipe was written down and passed around by people time and time again. And Henry received a version of this recipe, and he wrote it out in English, because that was a part of his ministry. He looked at the whole person. The whole person. Now, I'm not saying we go out and we become physicians. That'll get us into trouble very quickly. But in the 18th century, this was a part of Henry's ministry. Boxes of medicines will be sent from Halle to the Delaware Valley for the pastors to distribute and to sell, to distribute to the poor for free and to those who could afford it for money. This was part of the wonderful vision of Halle. They will send books and medicines that the pastors can sell. Why send them German currency? They'll only have to have it converted and they'll lose out on it. We can send them items that they can sell, books and medicine. And so Henry will do that. And he will also write down these recipes that he has, and this is an important part of his ministry as he looks at the whole person. Social ministry is a part of Henry's vision. This is the second part of his confirmation class in 1764. Look at the ages. Confirmation is normally 12, 13 years of age. These were people who had been indentured servants, girls until they were 18, boys until they were 21. They had no education at all. They could not read or write. So what does Henry do? He makes it clear in his journals, they're not going into the other class because they will be embarrassed. He invites them to his home on Thursday night, and he will instruct them privately, giving them private instruction, because that's his call, that's his vision. And he will teach them the catechism using poems. The order of salvation that had been put into verse, he is going to use poetry to instill in them the points of faith. And he will do it privately in his home on a Thursday night so that these individuals are not embarrassed, so that they can be confirmed and come to communion. This was part of Henry's vision. Here's Henry's own commonplace book where he took notes, and he's writing out the order of salvation in verse so that he can use it, put it in his saddlebag, and take it with him. And now he has a girl who is 16 years of age, whose mother was a Quaker. She never learned German. What do I do? Here is Henry Melchior Muhlenberg taking that poetry and translating it into English, creating English poetry, English verse, so that he can teach this young girl the points of faith through poetry so that she can take it with her. And here is his work, sitting there at night trying to translate this and to give the gospel, the word, and the sacraments to this individual. Henry Helmut is the one who succeeded Henry as senior pastor down in Zion and St. Michael. Henry had a little different vision, and this is where German became the exclusive language of the ministerium, and they sort of insulated the congregation. If Henry had been alive, that would not have happened. That was a part of Henry Helmut and sort of creating. And then a church had to be built across the street, St. John's, where English was used. You could not use English within the walls of St. Michael's and Zion. If Henry had been alive, that would not have happened. But Henry Helmut lived social ministry. He is pastor of Zion and St. Michael's, and in 1793, he is in the city of Philadelphia when the yellow fever epidemic breaks out. He doesn't leave. He stays in the city of Philadelphia, and he keeps a diary. In 3 months, he will bury 610 parishioners. What he will do is go out to the cemetery in the morning and just stand there and wait for the bodies to be brought so that he can give them Christian burial. He keeps this diary of what it was like to be in the city of Philadelphia during that epidemic. When others were fleeing, Henry Helmut stayed because that was his vision of ministry. And he keeps a list of the number of funerals that he is conducting each day and who is being buried in the various cemeteries. He's taking down the weather observations that he's read from David Rittenhouse. And this diary was so important that it was translated into English the following year, so that others could see this ministry of Henry Helmut in the city of Philadelphia during the yellow fever epidemic. That was part of the vision of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg, the legacy that was passed on, that social ministry is a part of our vision. I'm sorry, I got the number wrong. It was 641 that he buried in 3 months, not 610, but 641. Down on Girard and Corinthian Avenue, Girard and Corinthian was a building called the Hospital, the German hospital. It had been renovated and enlarged by the vision of John Lankenau. And then in 1884, Sister Marie comes over from Germany, and she is going to be the Mother Superior of the new order of deaconesses that will be in the city of Philadelphia in this German hospital to give medical care to anyone free of charge. Regardless of your religion, your race, your color, that did not matter. If you come to this place, we will give you that care. That was the social ministry, that was the legacy of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg here within the Delaware Valley. And they served in that hospital, changed its name to Lankenau, and moved out to City Line Avenue. But that's where it started, and it was a part of that vision and that ministry. This was the Mother House, and this was the Mary Drexel Home that would care for the elderly. In the 19th century, this was part of the vision of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. There's Sister Marie's grave just outside of UPenn in Woodland Cemetery, as she gave her life on this side of the Atlantic for social ministry in service. This is the Kensington Dispensary for the treatment of tuberculosis. There they are in 1905 in Kensington, in this house, giving care for free, trying to help people who are suffering because they see the whole person. This is the legacy of Muhlenberg. The Kensington Dispensary for the treatment of tuberculosis. Rivercrest, a house out near Phoenixville where children who had been exposed to tuberculosis could come with fresh air, food, exercise, build their immune system. Maybe we can stave off the disease. Kensington Dispensary and Rivercrest. That's where it comes from. The legacy still continues here on this side of the Atlantic. This is one of the few rare photographs of Zion Lutheran Church in 1866 when they were celebrating their 100th anniversary. There's Muhlenberg on the one side and their recently deceased pastor Deme on the other. And there they are, within the walls of that sanctuary, celebrating the ministry of Henry Melchior Muhlenberg. This is where Congress will hold the Congressional Memorial Service for George Washington. And so there it is. And so I close this presentation on time. We thank God. We thank God that the greatest of Lutherans in America was not a bishop, was not a monk, a televangelist, or a peculiar mystic who saw visions. He was not even a seminary president. He wasn't even a seminary librarian or a faculty theologian, but a parish pastor who loved his people and his God, his church, and gave himself for them. These are not my words, but these are the words of Jerry Schmallenberger, president of Pacific Lutheran Seminary. That is it.